This isn't breaking news, it's a slow shift in global power, the kind that happens quietly while markets move and most people don't even notice. And in global trade, geography still runs the show, with a few narrow waterways carrying more weight than entire regions packed with resources. And the Strait of Hormuz is one of those places. A tight corridor where energy, politics, and military presence all intersect daily. It's not wide, it's not calm, and it's never fully predictable, which is exactly why it sits at the center of long-term U.S. strategic planning. For decades, the United States has treated this region as critical not because of headlines but because disruption here hits markets fast. Oil doesn't just flow through pipelines, it moves through shipping lanes. And when those lanes get tense, prices react almost immediately. That reaction doesn't wait for a crisis. It starts with uncertainty. And uncertainty is something traders price in before anything happens right now. Attention is back on U.S. naval movement, but not for the reasons you might hear in dramatic headlines or viral clips online. The focus is on presence, not invasion. And that difference matters more than most people realize when trying to understand the bigger picture. One of the ships involved is the USS Tripoli, a platform built for flexibility rather than large-scale war. It's designed to operate in complex environments, especially near coastlines where speed, adaptability, and coordination matter more than sheer size. On board is a Marine Expeditionary Unit, a self-contained force that can respond quickly to a wide range of scenarios without long preparation. This unit includes air, ground, and logistics components, making it capable of acting independently for short periods if required. But here's the key point. This is not an invasion force, and it's not structured for long-term occupation or large-scale combat operations. In U.S. military doctrine, scale is everything, and a few thousand Marines do not represent the beginning of a ground war. Instead, this kind of deployment signals flexibility, giving commanders options without committing to escalation unless necessary. That approach is often described as deterrence, but in practical terms it simply means being present and ready without acting first. Presence changes behavior, especially in high-risk zones where miscalculation can lead to serious consequences for multiple countries involved. Now shift to the financial angle, because this is where things get interesting for investors and anyone watching global markets closely. Energy markets are extremely sensitive to uncertainty, and even small disruptions can influence pricing, expectations, and long-term contracts. The Strait handles a meaningful share of global oil shipments, enough that any tension there quickly becomes a factor in market forecasts. But it's not about exact numbers. It's about confidence, and confidence in safe passage is what keeps global supply chains running smoothly. When that confidence drops, insurance costs rise, shipping slows, and companies begin adjusting their risk exposure across the board. That's where military presence plays a stabilizing role, not by eliminating risk but by reducing unpredictability in a very specific region. Iran, on the other hand, approaches the situation differently, relying on tactics designed to complicate rather than dominate outright. Fast boats, drones, and coastal systems are part of a strategy that focuses on disruption rather than direct confrontation with larger forces. These methods are not about winning traditional battles, they're about creating enough uncertainty to shift the balance of decision-making. And in global trade, even small disruptions can create ripple effects that reach far beyond the immediate region where they occur. That's why the U.S. focuses on maintaining open lanes, not through constant force but through consistent and visible presence. Naval patrols, surveillance systems, and communication channels all work together to reduce the chance of escalation through misunderstanding. This isn't about headlines, it's about systems. And systems are what keep global trade functioning even under pressure. From a financial perspective, this becomes a story about risk management, not conflict, and that distinction is important. Markets don't just react to events, they react to expectations, and expectations are shaped by signals like military movement. When assets are repositioned, analysts take notice not because of what is happening but because of what could happen next. That's where interpretation matters, because not every movement signals escalation and not every deployment leads to conflict. The U.S. regularly shifts resources between regions, balancing priorities based on current needs rather than long-term commitments. This flexibility allows for quick responses without locking into strategies that may not be needed as situations evolve over time. In this case, moving assets toward the Middle East reflects attention, not necessarily intention, and that's a crucial distinction. For investors, the takeaway isn't fear, it's awareness. Understanding how geopolitical signals influence pricing across energy markets, oil prices, shipping rates, and even currency movements can all be affected by perceived risk in key transit routes like Hormuz. But perception doesn't always match reality, and that gap is where opportunity and volatility often emerge at the same time. Professional investors watch these signals closely, separating noise from actionable information that can impact long-term strategies. They look at patterns, not headlines, and they focus on how systems behave under pressure rather than reacting to single events. In that sense, the story is less about conflict and more about structure, how global systems adapt to ongoing uncertainty. Because uncertainty isn't new, it's built into the system, and markets have developed ways to absorb and respond to it over time. The real question isn't whether tension exists, it's how that tension is managed by the players involved on all sides. And right now management looks like presence, positioning, and signaling rather than immediate escalation or direct confrontation. That approach keeps options open, reduces surprises, and allows for adjustments without forcing irreversible decisions too early. In a world driven by interconnected systems, that kind of flexibility has real value, both strategically and financially, because at the end of the day, stability isn't about eliminating risk, it's about managing it in a way that keeps everything moving. And in places like the Strait of Hormuz, keeping things moving is what matters most for global stability, because when movement slows, pressure builds, and pressure in financial systems rarely stays contained to one region for long. Investors understand this, which is why attention shifts quickly whenever signals point toward increased tension in key transit zones. But attention doesn't always mean panic, and experienced players know the difference between noise and meaningful change. That's where disciplined analysis comes in, focusing on long-term patterns rather than reacting to short-term narratives. In this case, the pattern is familiar. Presence increases when uncertainty rises and decreases when stability returns. The United States has followed this model for decades, adjusting posture without overcommitting to any single outcome. It's a balancing act, maintaining readiness while avoiding unnecessary escalation that could create larger problems. That balance is what defines modern military strategy, especially in economically sensitive regions like the Gulf. And it's also what defines smart capital allocation in uncertain environments. Because just like military planners, investors manage risk by keeping options open and avoiding overexposure to any single scenario. That mindset becomes especially important when geopolitical tension intersects with global supply chains and energy markets. The connection between security and finance is tighter than most people think, even if it's not always visible on the surface. Every shipping route, every insurance contract, and every futures trade reflects a layer of that connection. And when one layer shifts, the effects move outward, influencing decisions far beyond the original point of tension. That's why regions like the Gulf remain under constant observation, not just by governments but by financial institutions worldwide, because the stakes are not limited to one country, they're embedded in systems that support the global economy, and those systems rely on predictability, even if they're built to handle occasional disruption along the way. When predictability drops, volatility rises, and volatility creates both risk and opportunity depending on how it's managed. That dual nature is what makes situations like this so important to understand clearly and without exaggeration. Overstating risk can be just as damaging as ignoring it, especially in markets where sentiment drives short-term behavior. That's why serious analysis avoids dramatic claims and focuses instead on what can actually be observed and verified. In this case, what we see is repositioning, not mobilization. And signaling, not commitment to conflict. Those distinctions matter because they shape how both governments and markets respond over time. When signals are misread, reactions can overshoot reality, creating unnecessary instability in already sensitive systems. That's where experience becomes valuable, recognizing patterns that have played out before under similar conditions. The Strait of Hormuz has seen tension before, and each time responses have followed familiar strategic frameworks. Presence increases, communication lines stay open, and efforts are made to prevent isolated incidents from escalating further. This doesn't eliminate risk, but it reduces the likelihood of sudden, uncontrolled developments that could disrupt global flows. And in financial terms, reducing uncertainty is often enough to stabilize expectations even if underlying tensions remain. That's why markets don't just watch events, they watch responses and how quickly systems adapt to changing conditions. A measured response tends to calm volatility, while unpredictable reactions tend to amplify it across multiple sectors. In this scenario, the response so far reflects control rather than urgency, and that distinction shapes market behavior. It suggests that while risks exist, they are being managed within established frameworks rather than spiraling out of control. That kind of signal carries weight, especially for institutional investors making decisions based on risk-adjusted returns, because at that level, it's not about reacting fast, it's about reacting correctly based on reliable information. And reliable information often looks less dramatic than what appears in headlines or social media discussions. It's quieter, more measured, and focused on what is likely rather than what is possible under extreme scenarios. That difference is what separates informed analysis from speculation, especially in complex geopolitical environments. And it's also what keeps long-term strategies grounded even when short-term noise becomes hard to ignore. Looking ahead, the key factor will be consistency, whether current patterns hold or begin to shift in a meaningful way. Consistency in presence, communication, and behavior tends to reinforce stability even in regions with ongoing tension. Sudden changes, on the other hand, are what markets watch most closely because they often signal a shift in underlying strategy. For now, the signals remain steady, indicating attention and readiness rather than preparation. For large-scale conflict, that doesn't mean risks disappear, it means they are being contained within a framework designed to manage them effectively, and containment in both military and financial terms is often the goal when dealing with complex evolving situations. Because full resolution is rare, but controlled stability is achievable with the right balance of tools and strategy. That balance is what defines current conditions in the region, at least from a structural and financial perspective. It's not perfect, but it's functional, and in global systems, functionality is often enough to maintain forward momentum. And momentum is what keeps economies running even when underlying conditions are less than ideal. So the real story here isn't escalation, it's management, how systems respond to pressure without breaking under it. That applies to military posture, financial markets, and the broader network of global trade that connects them. Each piece plays a role, and each adjustment sends signals that others interpret and act upon in real time. Understanding those signals is key, not just for policymakers but for anyone trying to navigate today's economic landscape, because the impact of these dynamics doesn't stay overseas, it shows up in fuel prices, shipping costs, and investment returns. It becomes part of everyday economic reality even if the underlying causes feel distant or abstract. That's the nature of interconnected systems. Local actions can have global consequences, especially in critical regions. And the Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most critical of all, not because of constant crisis but because of constant importance. Its role doesn't change even when headlines fade, and that's what makes it worth watching over the long term, because long-term importance is what drives sustained attention from both governments and markets alike. Short-term events may come and go, but structural relevance keeps certain regions permanently in focus. And that focus shapes decisions from military deployments to capital allocation across industries and sectors. In that sense, this is not just a regional story, it's part of a much larger system that affects global stability, a system where energy security and finance are deeply interconnected in ways that are not always immediately visible. But once you see the connections, the pattern becomes clearer and the signals become easier to interpret over time. That clarity is what allows both strategists and investors to operate with confidence even in uncertain environments. Not because uncertainty disappears, but because it becomes something that can be measured and managed effectively, and management, not elimination, is the real objective when dealing with complex global systems. That's true for military strategy, and it's just as true for financial decision-making at every level, because in both worlds success depends on staying prepared without overreacting to every new development. That balance is what keeps systems stable even when conditions are far from ideal beneath the surface. And it's what allows progress to continue even in environments where tension never fully disappears. In that context, current developments are not a break from the norm, they are part of an ongoing pattern. A pattern of adjustment, response, and recalibration that defines how global systems operate over time. Understanding that pattern is more valuable than reacting to any single moment within it. Because moments pass but patterns persist, and patterns are what shape long-term outcomes. That's where real insight comes from, not from isolated events but from how those events fit into a broader structure. And right now that structure remains intact even as it continues to adapt to new pressures and challenges. That adaptability is a strength both for global systems and for those who understand how to navigate them effectively, because adaptability creates resilience, and resilience is what allows systems to keep functioning under stress. So while attention may rise and fall, the underlying dynamics remain consistent, shaped by strategy, economics, and geography, and those dynamics will continue to influence decisions long after any single headline fades from public view. That's why this story matters, not for what it suggests today but for what it represents over the long term. A reminder that stability is maintained, not assumed, especially in regions where so much is at stake, and that maintaining stability requires constant effort, coordination, and awareness from multiple players involved. It's not dramatic, it's not sudden, but it's essential to keeping global systems moving forward without disruption. And in the end, that's what this comes down to: movement, continuity, and the ability to manage risk effectively, because when those elements are in place, even high-risk environments can remain functional over time, and when they're not, the effects are felt quickly, not just locally but across the global economy. That's the real significance of places like the Strait of Hormuz, not constant crisis but constant importance. And that importance ensures it will remain a focal point for both strategy and investment decisions moving forward, because as long as global trade depends on key transit routes, those routes will shape the flow of both goods and capital. And understanding that flow is what separates informed perspectives from reactive ones in an increasingly complex world. So instead of focusing on extremes, the smarter approach is to watch pattern signals and responses over time, because that's where the real story is, not in sudden shifts but in how systems adapt without breaking. And right now adaptation is exactly what we're seeing, steady, measured, and designed to maintain balance. It may not grab attention the way headlines do, but it's far more important in shaping long-term outcomes, because long-term outcomes are what ultimately define both geopolitical stability and financial performance. And those outcomes are built step by step through decisions that prioritize control over chaos. In the end, this isn't about escalation, it's about maintaining a system that the world depends on every single day.